So this is our Simondon reading group. We're coming back after a week off. We're picking up from page 169 of the translation at the bottom of the page. So we're still in part 4. I think last time we started section C of part 4. So this is invention as the production of a created object or of a work. So as I mentioned last time, this part or this section is sort of picking up on some of the themes from his other major book, on the mode of existence of technical objects, that we read together a few years ago now. So part of the idea of this section has to do with the way that an invention is something separate from the inventing being. So in the case of humans, of course, as sort of the typical case of invention, you produce a machine or device or apparatus of some kind that is a separate entity from you as the inventor. And Simondon argues that this is sort of characteristic of human invention in a way that is not the case for other animals that use technical objects of various kinds, or that use tools of various kinds. So like you have a sort of typical case of tool use is certain monkeys, or I think chimpanzees, that will take a stick and insert it into a tree branch to get ants that live in the tree and then that it can eat. But then the stick itself is discarded after that operation. It's not the stick is not itself a sort of product. It's just an instrument for getting something else. Whereas in the case of human tools, most often they involve some sort of preparation process, and then they're retained after they're used, so they can be used multiple times. And then also you have the use of tools to produce further tools. So you might use a saw to produce I don't know, a piece of wood that you then use to as a lever, or to, I don't know, as the handle of a hammer or whatever. So you use one tool to produce another tool, and then you retain both tools. And so whether this is entirely distinctive of human beings in the way that Simondon suggests, or whether there's more of a sort of continuum with other animal tool use, I think is probably a difficult question to decide. I think I mentioned a few sessions ago that there's some experiments with crows who are able to use one stick to grab another stick, and then use the second stick to grab a piece of meat and eat it. So here we have, using one tool to not produce a second tool, but to make another tool accessible. So you have a certain second order tool use in this case with crows. And there's also instances, if I remember correctly, otters will use rocks to break open shells, and they hold on to the rocks between uses. So this is to some extent a sort of tool use that retains the tool instead of just discarding it. Though I don't think they do anything to prepare the rocks. I think they just pick them up as they are. So again, you can find points of comparison with other animals that maybe the distinction is not quite as clear as Simondon is setting it out here. But anyway, that's the sort of point of distinction that Simondon wants to draw, is that human tools, human inventions they form an entity distinct from the inventor in a way that most animal tool use does not produce. And so then he gives us some sort of contrast with this idea of the invention as production of an entity. So he gives us these instances of technical objects where there's not so much an invention as an adaptation. And so the distinction here is between invention involves so as he describes it on the mode of existence of technical objects, invention involves a technical essence. So there's something, there's a sort of schema of functioning of the technical object that has to be created by the inventor or the group of people who invent an object, and so the object is sort of is not really possible until it already exists. There's a sort of circular feedback between the object and its conditions of possibility. So it's the one example that he gives on the mode of existence of technical objects is the kind of turbine where the cooling process that makes the turbine functional is brought about by the rotation of the turbine itself, if I remember correctly. So here there's a sort of circular feedback in the sense that the functioning of the turbine is precisely what makes it possible for the turbine to function. And so there's a sort of coherence of a technical schema. There's like different functions that all sort of make each other possible and condition each other in that sense. But then the sort of contrast with this is the case of adaptation, where it's not a schema of functioning where each element makes the others possible. It's a kind of adjustment of a technical object to the needs of a human or the desires of a human. And so he talks about the sort of aesthetics of technicity, and he talks about like cars that have aluminum dashboards, and this is talking about 1950s or so cars. So I'm not like super familiar with what exactly these cars would have consisted in, but the way he describes it here, aluminum is in the case of airplanes, it has a functional role in the sense that it provides the required structural strength of the object with minimum weight. It's lighter than other metals. On a race car or even a sort of domestic car, it and especially on the dashboard, the weight saving of using aluminum instead of some other metal is minimal. But the aluminum still has it sort of conveys a message of high techness to other people who see this car. So the role of the aluminum dashboard is not actually a functional role in terms of making the car operate better or making other aspects of the car function. It has a signifying role. It conveys a message to the observer. And he goes through an example in a fair amount of detail of the case of photography, of how there's a sort of continuum from the sort of purely technical the technical form of photography that is used in scientific photography. So here the camera is designed to produce the best possible image, and to be able to do that, you have to be able to adjust all the different settings of the camera, the light aperture, the lens, the lens settings, and everything has to be adjustable. And that means that if you don't know how to use it, if you just take this very precise camera and try to take a picture without knowing what to do, you're going to produce a terrible picture. So it requires a certain amount of knowledge to be able to adjust it properly and produce a good picture. And then the sort of extreme other end is the camera for tourists or for just home use, where most of the settings are sort of preset. So it has very little adjustability, and it's just designed to take a picture under normal light settings of an object, maybe a couple meters away. So under these sort of normal conditions, you can take a decent picture without knowing anything about optics or the skill of photography. And then there's sort of intermediate cases, like he describes a photojournalist camera. So this is someone who might have to take pictures under a variety of different settings, but is not necessarily concerned with getting the most accurate possible picture, but instead getting a picture that sort of evokes the nature of a scene. And so this kind of camera has some degree of adjustability, but not as much as the scientific camera. So again, you have this sort of continuum of possibilities in terms of how much of the technical capacity of a camera is available to the user, and then the adaptation to the user in this case consists of sort of cutting off certain technical possibilities, just limiting the scope of adjustability so that you can get a sort of decent result with minimal knowledge. And so this is an interesting comment from Angus. So the tool for expert use is closer to the conditions of invention because the expert has to have something more similar to the knowledge of the original discovery, and then the tool for popular use is sort of further from that moment of invention. And yeah, I think that's right. You obviously the invention of a camera is a very different kind of action compared to the use of a camera that's already invented. But at the same time, some of the knowledge of optics, of the chemistry of photosensitive substances and so on, you have to have that knowledge whether you're going to invent a camera or you're going to use one of these scientific cameras. So you need similar kinds of knowledge to be able to use these more expert types of equipment. And then in the case of the tourist camera, you don't need any scientific knowledge. They're advertised as like point and shoot kind of devices, so you don't need to know anything about how to, what light settings to use or what lens to use in particular circumstances. So again, you're not required to have any sort of scientific knowledge to be able to use the device. Okay, so I think that's mostly what we saw last time. We can jump into the reading. So if I can get someone to read from the bottom of 169, just read. This is one of these giant multi-page paragraphs. Just try to read a page or so and find an adequate stopping point.
I can read. But I just want to say really quick, the tool for like amateur use, or the invention that has been made accessible to the amateur, maybe we could see it as somewhat alienating in the Hegelian sense, in that because the user doesn't have to have the knowledge base that is close to the knowledge base of the inventor, it's more difficult for the amateur user to see the invention as an invention, like something that has been created by human action and by human insight, and it just sort of appears as more closed off to the user and sort of has maybe like a higher degree of objectivity because it's more opaque. But maybe that's forcing the Hegelian connection.
Yeah, that's interesting to talk here about Hegel, but what comes to mind is actually Latour, his concept of a black box. So he talks about how the sort of development of a scientific fact or a technical object, these are sort of parallel developments. You start with something that is very sort of tenuous, some sort of effect that you might notice in the laboratory, some trace on a sheet of graph paper or on a computer screen or whatever, and then you sort of build up the defenses around this very tenuous trace, and you make it harder and harder to contest the presence of this scientific fact, and part of that is like building technical devices that are based on this scientific fact, so that the basic sort of principles of electromagnetism, for example, are built into thousands of electronic devices. And so if you wanted to try to contest these principles, you would have to sort of build alternate devices that work under different principles. And obviously that's a huge undertaking to restructure. Our whole society is built around electrical power and electronic devices. So to be able to build an alternate system would be you have to build a whole new industrial system essentially. And so, I think some of these amateur devices have a similar black box type of quality in that they just sort of produce an effect, and we don't really know how, and to to reverse engineer one of these devices, you have to would require you to have to acquire all that technical knowledge that you sort of avoided having to learn by using this amateur device. So yeah, it makes the technical knowledge, it sort of incarnates the technical knowledge in the device itself, and makes it something external and sort of closed off to the user, in the same way that by incorporating these principles of electromagnetism or whatever into a device, it means that they can just be used without anyone, by people who don't necessarily know anything about the principles themselves.
That's really interesting. I've never read Latour, but I will definitely look into that.
But okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, thanks. That was a good comment though. But yeah, let's start with the reading from 169.
Okay. Other examples could be provided if the question was to study the evolutionary facts of technical objects for themselves. But for the present study, what is important is to note the fact that an invention or a major improvement upon an already invented apparatus in order to perfect it is an act that institutes a compatibility between processes initially incompatible. For photography, it is the physical process of formation of a real image or chemical processes that are made compatible through none of the late image. This compatibility belongs to the category of states of equilibrium, enabling the temporal succession of phase expansion of an activity. In other cases, the compatibility is of a topological order, such as the invention of Marc Seguin, who created the tubular boiler for the production of thermal energy in mobile stations, locomotives, ships, and locomobiles. In a fixed station, in order to increase the yield of the furnace-boiler ratio, the heating surface was increased through the addition of exterior boilers to the main boiler's cylindrical body. This apparatus could very well have been generalized, since we can easily imagine a proliferation of boilers around a boiler unit. But this apparatus cannot be applied specifically to a terrestrial vehicle because of its great weight and size, its fragility, and the need for a heat-proof lodging, channeling the flame around the boilers. Seguin made the simple cylindrical boiler compatible with multiple accessory boilers by inverting the boiling schema and placing the other boilers within the main boiler, which not only increases the heating surface but diminishes the mass of water to be heated. The inversion of the accessory boiler schema means that water is no longer inside and hot gases outside, but that gases are in tubes parallel to the axis of the boiler with water around them. In this way, the heat-proof lodging is gotten rid of, the furnace directly sending the flame and hot gases into the tubes within the boiler. These tubes thus become multifunctional, since on the one hand they channel hot air, and on the other they serve as thermal exchangers. There is nothing else but these tubes between the furnace and the smoke box located at both ends of the main boiler. In an almost paradoxical way, the outside envelope of the main boiler can become heat-proof, since all the thermal exchange is condensed on the interior. The multifunctional character is completed by the fact that the reduced furnace produces only part of the combustion, which is extended inside the tubes throughout the boiler when gas-rich coal is used. Hence, the invention contributes a wave of condensations and concretizations that simplify the object by charging every structure with a plurality of functions. Not only are the former functions kept and optimized, but the concretion brings about novel properties, complementary functions that were not sought after, and which could be called, quote, supernumerary functions, unquote, constituting the class of a veritable advent of possibilities coming to be added to the expected properties of the object. Through this amplifying aspect, invention is an opportunity for discovery in the area of technics, since the properties of the object exceed expectations. It would be partially wrong to say that the invention is made in order to reach a goal, to implement an effect entirely predictable in advance. An invention is occasioned by a problem that arises, but the effects of an invention go beyond the resolution of a problem thanks to the supernumerary aspects of the created object when it is really invented. These effects do not merely represent a conscious and limited organization of means towards a goal entirely known before implementation. In a true invention, there is a leap in amplifying power that goes beyond simple finality and the limited search for an adaptation. So it seems like here he's talking about, so both an invention or a major improvement on an invention. So maybe these major improvements would be improvements to the kind of essential problem resolution that the invention effects between whatever disparation it is that it resolves, as opposed to the kind of superficial user-oriented appurtenances, which are not major improvements because they don't deal with the core invention, like photography or the way a boiler functions.
Yeah, this bit is definitely drawing on the mode of existence of technical objects. And so here, one of the key concepts that he develops in that book is concretization. And so this is what I was sort of alluding to earlier, in the way that technical object, the concreteness of a technical object, or a technical object becomes more concrete, the more its different functions all sort of contribute to each other. So in this case of the boiler, I don't know a lot about these boilers and exactly how they function, but the idea here, as far as I understand, is that the tubes end up becoming multifunctional. They don't just play one role. They don't just contribute one function to the functioning of the whole boiler apparatus. Instead they have multiple different functions. And so an example that he gives on the mode of existence of technical objects that I think maybe helps to explain this concept is a certain type of internal combustion engine where the cylinder has sort of veins on it that help to dissipate heat. But the sort of the first sort of less concrete form of the engine is one where you just have the cylinder plus a radiator or some sort of heat dissipation mechanism. So you have one element of the engine that produces power and another element that dissipates heat, and they're just sort of externally joined together to each other. And then the more concrete version of the engine is the one that has the vanes in the cylinder, and these vanes allow for heat dissipation, but they also allow, because of the shape of the cylinder with these vanes in it, the cylinder has more structural integrity, and therefore the walls of the cylinder can be made thinner, which also helps with heat dissipation. So the vanes play a structural role and a heat dissipation role at the same time, and so they contribute multiple functions to the functioning of the engine as a whole. And Simondon compares this concretization, or the more concrete technical object, to a living being. So in a living being, of course, every part has multiple different functions, and they all sort of make each other possible. Like a heart on its own is not an organism. It can't survive on its own. It has to receive oxygen from the lungs. It has to receive nutrients that are digested by the stomach, etc., etc. Every organ has to be combined with other organs to be able to function at all. And so the whole organism is more concrete because each of the organs, or each of the components of the organism, plays multiple roles, and each of them makes the others possible. And so this is sort of the idea that he's getting at here, is that a real invention, either of a new technical object or a major improvement on an existing technical object, involves not just sort of adding a new function to an existing object, or making a sort of incremental improvement in the efficiency of a boiler or something like that, but it involves sort of rethinking the creation of this new schema of operation in which the different elements come to play multiple roles. They have multiple functions in the functioning of the whole technical object. And so this is a sort of different operation of thought. You have to be able to understand the relationship of these different parts to each other, and foresee what would happen if the different parts were connected to each other in a certain way. And so this is a kind of, you have to sort of project into the future this kind of functioning of the technical object in this multifunctional way. So that's why he's describing this as a kind of leap, and it's also it's not sort of directly oriented towards a goal in the way that so like I don't know, you might make a boiler bigger. Like if you make the boiler 5% bigger, maybe you can get 2% more power out of it or something like that. You just sort of take an existing object and make an incremental improvement to it, and that's a goal directed action. But then the restructuring the boiler, even if you do have a goal in mind of making the boiler more efficient or produce more power or whatever, the schema of operation of this boiler is not sort of directly determined by that goal. You have to understand and be able to produce this schema of functioning in your thought that is not sort of, you can't sort of read it off of your goal. You can't just say the goal is more power, therefore I make it a little bit bigger. You have to, even if you have a goal of more power, you have to rethink the way that the different parts interact with each other. So that's why he describes it as not being goal directed or not having this same goal directedness as an incremental improvement.
Do you think he sees concretization as a kind of transduction, in the sense that an amplification, like it propagates the initial invention, even though it's not. I guess it would be the kind of repetitive as opposed to iterative. I guess it would be a transduction, kind of transformational transduction, because it's not just like incremental improvements. As I'm trying to picture, like if like concretization is the individuation of the technical object, I'm trying to figure out like what the milieu is that it is propagating through.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think so. One element of this is that a technical object always has an environment just in the physical sense. So, like an engine has to dissipate heat out into the atmosphere, for example. It has to take in fuel, etc. All these different sort of preconditions have to be there for the technical object to function. And part of this process of concretization, part of what happens is that some of those elements of the environment are sort of incorporated into the functioning of the technical object itself. So, for example, the heat dissipation is not just sort of left to the fact that the engine happens to be surrounded by air, but instead you add a mechanism that is deliberately designed to push air across the engine so that it dissipates heat or water or whatever. So here you have it's not just a sort of passive precondition of the possibility for the technical object to function, but instead you have an active incorporation of some condition into the functioning of the object itself. So that's one element, I think. And then he also talks about in that book the incorporation of technical objects into technical networks. So, like again, like if you stick with the example of a motor, internal combustion motor. So this motor is only useful if you can get the fuel that you need, diesel or gasoline or whatever. So there has to be, like a factory that refines this type of fuel. There has to be extraction of petroleum products from the earth. There has to be, a transportation network to get the refined product to the user, and then in all the other conditions, there has to be the factory that produces the engine, the factories that produce the metal that is used to produce the engine, etc. So there's this huge network of all these technical systems that sort of go into producing an internal combustion engine and making it useful. And so he suggests that the technical network is sort of a higher level of individuation compared to the technical object, because the object is always the individual technical object, the individual engine or whatever, is always dependent on these networks that are outside of it for its functioning. Whereas the system, the technical network as a whole, has a certain amount of autonomy. It sort of functions without having to take in inputs from other systems. So yeah, I think we can see this development of the technical object into a technical network as a process of sort of making the environment, structuring the environment of the technical object in such a way that it has a kind of autonomy. So instead of like in the early stages of development of say steam engines, you had like every workshop had to sort of build their own steam engine and make sure that they could get the coal they needed or other materials, etc. And then through the development or over the course of development of these steam engines, you have more and more sort of institutionalization of these networks of production. You have factories that are dedicated to producing steam engines. You have the mining and distribution of coal becomes regularized, etc. All of these things together produce, they sort of structure the environment of that engine in such a way that it is able to function reliably. Yeah, I'll just plug again the On the Mode of Existence of Technical Objects because it's a very interesting work. There's a lot of really interesting content in that book. There's some difficult parts where he talks about vacuum tubes and stuff at great length, which are a bit obscure for those of us who are not like experts in 1950s electronics. But it definitely repays multiple readings. Okay, let's go on to the next bit. So if I could get someone to read from 171 in the translation, I believe we're at the supernumerary functions.
I can read. The supernumerary functions may sometimes be secondary and simply useful as additions. They can also become primordial so that the discovery takes over the initial intention. For an example of an only additive function, we may refer in the case above to the fact that the external wall of a tubular boiler may replace an outer frame because of its rigidity and perfectly rectilinear geometrical shape, which the addition of extra boilers no longer overloads. This affordance has been used in locomotives, which brings gain of weight in space. By contrast, when Lee de Forest introduced a control grid between the cathode and anode in the original thermoelectric valve, he not only made possible the control of the electronic flux, providing a switch with an infinity of intermediary states between on and off. Within a few years, the vacuum triode became the central component of amplifiers for telephone electrical power within the frequency band of musical sounds. Then it displayed its remarkable properties for frequencies corresponding to Hertzian waves, not only in amplification and oscillation assemblies, but also in modulating and detecting functions. A new wave of properties of the electronic tube emerged with the introduction, for electrostatic insulation, of a grid screen between the control grid and the anode. While carrying out its function of electrostatic screen, the grid screen also produced an accelerating effect on the electron flux, increasing the inner resistance of the tube and making the flux nearly independent of the electrical potential of the anode. The introduction of a third grid very close to the anode as suppressor of secondary emission did not only fulfill this function of one-way barrier, but also brought the possibility of modulation by electronic means. Every invention, rather than being limited to solving a single problem, brings about a gain in supernumerary functions.
You can continue to the bottom of this page, I think. Thanks.
In order to describe the main features of invention as formalization, however, it is not necessary to consider exclusively technical objects within the industrial sector. The industrial technical object belongs to the more general category of artificial objects that represent in various domains the achievement of a formalization leading to supernumerary functions. If we take, for instance, the arched vault as a process of construction, we can discern the multifunctional character of various components, acting on the one hand as relays in the transfer of compression forces, and on the other hand as part of the surface layer. Each stone is in part roof, in part wall, and even the arch's keystone receives and transmits forces coming from other components. This communication of force affixes components one against the other through their sheer trapezoidal shape, requiring neither anchor nor cement. Gravity, which creates the difficulty and poses a problem of equilibrium, is used as a means of cohesion in the final edifice. Gravity is integrated in the arch vault and works within the edifice. A segment of the arch vault would be on its own unbalanced. All the segments of the arch vault taken together produce a mutual equilibrium, so that not only is the whole balanced without flat components susceptible to bending as beams do, but moreover the compensated disequilibria generate forces bringing the various parts of the building closer together, most notably upward. These supernumerary functions enable the arch vault to support another arch vault above itself, stacking several stories as in the bridge of the Guard River. The forces developed within the formalized whole that is the arch vault exceed its order of magnitude. The resolution of the problem through formalization creates an artificial object endowed with properties that exceed the problem. Genuine invention transcends its own end. The initial intention of solving a problem is only a trigger, a mobilization. Progress is essential to inventions that constitute created objects, because the object endowed with new properties beyond those that solve the problem transcends the conditions of the original position of the problem.
Right, so here we get another example of this kind of multifunctionality of a technical object. So the arch here is an interesting example because it's in some respects, it's a very simple technical object compared to an internal combustion engine, for example. It's been known for thousands of years. It doesn't require, this sort of vast network of technical processes like an internal combustion engine does. But at the same time, it's also very sophisticated in the sense that you have the problem is how do you support something against gravity, and in the solution of the arch, you are actually using gravity to solve that problem, because the gravity, the pull on each of the stones in an arch actually presses the stones against each other and holds them together. So here you have each stone of the arch. So as Simondon says, it functions both as a wall and as a ceiling at the same time. So it as opposed to a sort of more traditional building where you have a wall or a joist that supports the ceiling, you have one element of the building that serves the function of vertical support of resisting against gravity, and then you have another element of the building, the ceiling or roof or whatever, that serves to cover the interior of the building and protect it from rain or sun or other factors in the environment. So you have these sort of two discrete functions that are separate from each other, but the arch combines these two functions into one. So each element of the arch actually plays both roles at the same time. And so here the arch is much more stable as a technical object. And yeah, there are Roman buildings 2,000 plus years old that are still viable, that are still standing. Precisely because these arches are so stable, just in the physical sense, but also they have a certain stability, a kind of like self-productive nature, in the sense that whereas a building with a wall plus a roof, each element has to be present for the whole thing to. So each element contributes one function to the building, and then if you sort of remove one element, the whole thing collapses. If you take down a load-bearing wall in a building, the whole thing collapses. Whereas an arch has this nature of self-production. Each element contributes to the functioning of all the other elements. So there's not like one piece that you can like remove and have the whole thing fall apart. So it's more stable in that sense as well. And yeah, I posted I copied the picture there of the Pont du Gard, this bridge that has I guess 3 layers of arches. So it's like a set of arches and then another set of arches on top of it. So that's pretty cool.
I think you mentioned formalization at the beginning of this paragraph on 172. That was helpful for me because it links the invention back to the earlier discussion of formalization, where he starts from the formalization of the command, which becomes kind of the instructions in a geometry textbook. And it's helpful to see the invention as a similar kind of formalization, which has this ability to propagate or to be transductive once it's formalized, and then can bring about the structuration of these different domains.
Yeah, I think here the formalization, we can think of it as a kind of externalization, like in the same way that we saw with the command as an externalization. So when you have a sort of independent production process, so someone just produces a tool or some sort of device for their own use, they don't need to be able to explain what they're doing. They just know how to manipulate the clay or the stone or whatever it is they're working on. They have this implicit knowledge, but then when they have to command someone else to do something, then they have to externalize that knowledge. They have to put it into an explicit form that can be communicated to someone else. So this is a kind of externalization process. This formalization is a kind of externalization. And then it's the same type of thing, or there's a similar kind of externalization at work when you produce a technical object, in the sense that you're taking some sort of knowledge of the properties of the components of this object or the materials that it's made of, etc. You take all this knowledge and you incarnate it into a technical object that has this sort of schema of functioning. So the arch, for example, takes a certain knowledge of statics and sort of incarnates that into a technical object that realizes that schema of functioning. Even if that knowledge of statics was not explicit, like if you didn't have, say, a textbook of statics in front of you, if you just are a sort of practical engineer that knows how to build an arch, you're still using a kind of implicit knowledge of statics and the properties of materials and so on. You're taking this knowledge and building an object that realizes that knowledge. And then someone else can come along, like someone who doesn't know what an arch is, someone who doesn't have any knowledge of statics, can find an arch and study its properties and learn how it functions. So the functioning of this arch can be sort of extracted from the technical object as it, just as an object existing in the world and without any explicit teaching. So yeah, it's a kind of externalization of knowledge that incarnates it into a physical object. Yeah, and so I think this is maybe the distinction between what we call an action and what we call a work. And so this idea of the action as creating a work is one of the key points of this whole section of this part, is so that an action like, I don't know, swinging a baseball bat, it happens over a certain span of time, or you can have an action like fighting a war that might last years. But anyway, there's a certain span of time, whether it's seconds, days, years, whatever. And then after that action is done, it sort of disappears. There's no product of that action, even if there might be consequences or results of that action. Whereas here, the work is a product of a certain kind of activity on the part of the inventor or producer, but it's distinct from, it has a separate existence from the producer. It subsists without the producers. You can build an arch and then die, or the whole civilization that built that arch can disappear. But the arch still functions, according to those principles of statics and materials and everything. And so you can, archaeologists thousands of years later can find this arch and learn about what sort of knowledge these people had, even if they have no idea, what language they spoke or anything else about the people. You can just learn from the material remains of their society. So yeah, the work here is external to the person or the people who create it, and functions independently of those people. It has its own sort of subsistence. It's not ontologically dependent on the person in the same way that an action is. Okay, let's go on to the next bit. Yeah, I can read this one. If invention were merely the organization of a given situation without the creation of an object, This incorporation of supernumerary functions within the universe of producible things would not occur, since organization would be confined to the resolution of a problem. But as soon as a separate object arises, the constraints of that object entail a long detour, a larger unit of measure that performs an incorporation of reality, in the same way that the evolution of life proceeds, according to Lamarck, by incorporating within organisms properties that were left to the random effects of the milieu, properties which become in more complex organisms the source of regular functions. This amplifying enjambement, exceeding the conditions of the problem, is necessitated in the creation of objects by invention, by the obstacles which give rise to an organization limited to a strict and direct finality. Thus, when stone construction was replaced with concrete, negative effects were encountered which prevented direct and non-amplifying replacement, possible cracks, uncontrolled dilation, or the poor resistance of concrete blocks to traction forces. Concrete had to be reinforced with metal bars. These elastic components, working through traction, played their role best if they were constantly kept in traction, whence the techniques of reinforced and pre-stressed concrete, which realized the amplifying enjambment characteristic of the invented object. Pre-stressed concrete enables the construction not only of what was formerly possible with stone, but also beams and cantilevers that only wood or metal could have made possible, with the advantage, gain, of a homogeneous linkage to the whole of the construction, and with the added benefit of the identity of coefficients of expansion. The building made of pre-stressed concrete surpasses that which would have been possible with stone, wood, and iron. Secondary negative effect, then, which needs to be addressed in the search for compatibility required by the formalization of the created object, structural and functional self-correlation, is at first limited by mitigations, but subsequently becomes a positive part of the functioning of the whole. Hence, in electronic tubes, the secondary discharge of electrons by the anode was at first a drawback, curtailed by the use of the third grid suppressor in the pentode structure. Subsequently, this effect was favorably incorporated into the function of the whole in the photomultiplier cell, in which the secondary cascading discharge effect is systematically triggered from dynode to dynode, causing the amplification of an initially weak flux of photoelectrons. In order to be fully organized, the created object must be more complex and polyvalent than the strict project of problem resolution presupposed. It then displays new properties, enabling it to solve, through an overabundance of being, surabondance d'être, other problems. It involuntarily incorporates other effects of the universe, since there does not usually exist a perfectly customized solution to a particular problem. The incorporation within a whole that is not only logically but actually and materially formalized like an organism, of effects that were not sought by the finalized intention of a problem resolution through organization, leads to a transcendence of the problem's conditions both potentially and in the universality of applications. This increase is comparable to a functional surplus value, caused by the work of natural realities incorporated in the created object, so that it can be entirely compatible with itself. In this way, through the necessity of technical progress, the group of created objects incorporates more and more natural reality. A superficial, non-dialectical view might lead one to believe that technics capitalizes an always greater sum of natural realities, impoverishing the universe of such realities. In fact, the group of created objects, incorporating ever more quote-unquote wild effects, becomes less and less arbitrary and less artificial in each of its elements. Nature is recreated as necessitating formalization and concretization within the universe of technics. The more techniques become objects, the more they tend to transfer nature into what is created. The progressive evolution of techniques, thanks to the amplifying surplus value of each invention that constitutes an object, transfers natural effects within the sphere of techniques, resulting in the progressive naturalization of techniques. The creative invention of objects is thus the last stage of a dialectical process transiting through perception. Perception corresponds to the stage in which effect depends upon the milieu and is produced in the presence of the subject. Through the surplus value of invention, the effect enters into the system of the created object. Invention takes nature into account as a necessary supplement to the simple, practical, and anthropocentric finality that only performed an organization by the most direct route. This supplement, required for the created object to become compatible with itself, performs an unexpected recruitment within the project of problem resolution, bringing about a solution broader than the problem. Progress, in the strong sense of the term, is the consequence of acts of invention. It goes beyond improvements targeted by the inventor and his inventions because, according to the expression of Teilhard de Chardin, the rooms are greater than the house. Quote, the room is greater than the house, unquote, that was planned to be built. Invention completes perception not only because it makes real in an object what perception apprehends, but also because it adds effects to the initial conditions rather than selecting them for information capture, as does perception in selecting among possibilities offered by the situation. For this reason, inventions that create objects, thanks to the recruitment of effects, convey to scientific discovery data that perceptual observation cannot extract from reality. Yeah, so there's a lot in this bit. to some extent, so maybe we start with the bit about the incorporation of functions into the object. So this is sort of what I was describing in the case of the internal combustion engine. So the early internal combustion engines or steam engines before that just sort of relied on the fact that the engine happens to be surrounded by air and the heat will be dissipated into the air. This is just a sort of precondition for the functioning of the object to ensure that it doesn't overheat and fuse and so on. But it's not like incorporated into the functioning of the object itself. It's just a natural condition that obtains in the environment of the object. And then later, as these objects become more sophisticated, more complicated, this function of cooling has to be incorporated into the object itself. So you have to add a radiator or some sort of cooling device to ensure that it doesn't overheat. And so here you're taking what was just a natural condition of the functioning of the object, and you're incorporating it into the object itself so that it retains this function under a variety of conditions. So in principle, you can run an engine like this even if it's not surrounded by air, as long as you have the radiator or whatever heat dissipation device. You have something that replaces the function that air was playing in the early engines. And so what this means is that as the technical object becomes more sophisticated and more concrete in Simondon's sense, it actually becomes more stable in the sense that it doesn't rely on these sort of circumstances of the environment in the same way as it did before. So the fact that the engine happens to be surrounded by air is no longer just a precondition for the function of the engine, but the cooling function is now actually part of that function itself. So the engine is less self-destructive in the sense that it contains its own sort of defense mechanism to prevent it from overheating. And so that means the whole schema of functioning of this object is more concrete. It's capable of a certain amount of autonomy in the sense that it doesn't its own functioning doesn't destroy it as directly as in the case of the earlier engines that required that cooling function from the air. And then there's this bit about tubes that I don't really understand because, again, this is like 1950s electronics that no one really uses anymore. But I think it's the same idea. It's you have something that initially appears as a kind of drawback or a kind of side effect of the functioning of the object, and then that side effect is later incorporated into the functioning of the object itself and actually used to produce a beneficial effect. So the early technical object where you have these negative side effects that you have to mitigate is less concrete. And then as the technical object develops, these side effects end up being incorporated into the functioning of the object. And so the object is less self-destructive and doesn't require these sort of mitigation devices to preserve itself. And then we have this fairly dense passage, which is very interesting to me for a number of reasons. So one is that, again, here he describes he uses the term dialectics or dialectical here in a positive sense. And we remarked on this when we were reading Individuation, that there are some passages where he sort of rejects dialectics, and he says that the types of thinking and ontological processes that he's describing are not dialectical. But then there are other passages where he does sort of describe his own thinking as dialectical. So there's a certain ambiguity in his work about, to what extent what he's talking about can be described as dialectical or dialectics. And so here, this is another passage where he gives a positive valence to the term dialectics. And then, there's a somewhat obscure theme here about the relationship between the technical universe and nature. And so he suggests that maybe a first view. So when you take this idea that the technical object incorporates some sort of natural function into itself, the way that the steam engine takes on the cooling function within itself, for example, when you add a radiator. So this idea that the technical universe sort of incorporates elements of nature into itself, you might think that this is a sort of zero-sum transfer, that like there's a total quantity of functions in the universe as a whole, and some of them are natural, some of them are technical, and then the development of technical objects would sort of subtract from the nature side and add these functions to the technical side. And so it would be a kind of impoverishment of nature to transfer elements of it into the technical universe. And Simondon suggests that this is, he calls this a non-dialectical, sort of unsophisticated appreciation of what nature means. So for him, I think the development of technical objects is a kind of recreation of nature, in the sense that a more concrete technical object approximates to a living being in a greater degree. So as I mentioned earlier, living beings have this property of concreteness, in the sense that every organ or every cell, every system in an organism, they all sort of contribute to the functioning of the whole organism, and they do so in a way that is not sort of parceled out into individual functions. Of course, there's specialization in an organism, but each of the elements of an organism plays multiple roles at the same time. And so as a technical object becomes more and more concrete, it becomes more and more similar to a living organism. And so our technical development, the progress of technical invention, as it incorporates more and more natural processes into its functioning, it at the same time is sort of recreating nature in the technical universe. It's making the technical universe more natural. And so it's less artificial, in the sense that it's less of a sort of bolting different functions onto each other externally, and more a sort of cooperation of functions towards the overall functioning of an object. So yeah, it's kind of a subtle point, I think, or a tricky point, but yeah, there's this idea of a recreation of nature within the technical universe. And so in this sense, there's not a sort of subtraction from the nature side of the equation, so that you can add to the technical side, but it's a kind of the technical itself becomes more natural. And so there's still nature, in the sense that the processes are still at work. It's just that they're now incorporated into the technical universe. So yeah, there's not this sort of zero sum transfer of functions from the natural to the technical. And then there's this other bit, as I said, there's a lot in this passage, but there's this other bit about perception, which he just sort of throws in here, that he hasn't really been talking about perception for a long time. There was some discussion of perception in earlier bits of this book, but then now he sort of brings it back in. And so I think we can see perception here. So he describes perception as sort of the middle stage of the process. So here we can think of like when you sort of see an effect of an object, it can be either a technical object or some sort of natural phenomenon. You see, for example, that the fire softens the metal, and then you think, okay, this metal is softer than it was before. Maybe that will make it easier to shape into the kind of tools that I want to use. So you have this sort of perception of an effect of a phenomenon, and you sort of look at the way that effect can be used to achieve a certain goal. This is sort of like a middle stage, or a less concrete kind of thinking, in the sense that here you have a goal and an object that are sort of external to each other, and then there's an effect that you perceive that sort of allows you to bridge between the goal and the object. But then what you do when you perform an invention is you're sort of you're not just perceiving effects and then realizing that they can be used to achieve a certain goal. You're sort of projecting a certain kind of functioning into the world. You're saying this combination or this interaction of functions in an object would produce this kind of effect if it existed. It doesn't exist yet, but if I put these elements together in this way, then it would produce this kind of result. And so this is something that you have to sort of create for yourself. You can't just observe. You don't just sort of walk around on a beach and find an internal combustion engine and like, you know, copy it and produce an invention. You have to actually perform a creative act of thought to bring about the invention of an internal combustion engine or any other complex technical object. So this creation, this act of creation, is goes beyond perception in the sense that it adds to what is there. So this is that passage that 61 posted in the chat here. So what perception sort of selects out of the environment what is important or worthy of attention at any given moment. So at any moment, all of your senses are active. Like there's certain noises going on in your environment, but you're sort of ignoring them because you're paying attention to, I don't know, the music you're listening to or the book you're reading or whatever. There's all kinds of visual phenomena. There's all kinds of light hitting your eyes that you're not paying attention to, etc. So all of this is happening, but out of the whole set of possible stimuli in your environment, you're selecting a few for attention when you perceive something. But invention, on the other hand, actually adds to the what is available in the environment. It takes the objects or materials or whatever that are available, and it creates something new out of them. It creates a new schema of functioning that wasn't present before. So it's in this sense that it sort of goes beyond perception. Yes, this is a very dense passage. It's always interesting with Simondon where you have these, you might have like long passages of just sort of description of different technical objects or different, psychological experiments or whatever. And then you have these like very dense conceptual paragraphs that just sort of come at the end of a section where you have to, where he sort of analyzes what he's been describing before and sort of puts it into these very succinct conceptual terms. There's a sort of shift of gears in between one page and the next. Okay. Any other comments or questions on this last bit that we just read? Yeah, the rooms are bigger than the house. Yeah, that's an interesting quote. I know almost nothing about Théâtre de Chardin, but I think here the way that Simondon is using this phrase is the idea is that when you invent something, you might have a goal in mind. You might have the idea that I want to produce an engine that is more powerful than the existing engines or more efficient or whatever. You have a particular goal that you're aiming at, but to be able to reach this goal, you actually have to go beyond just sort of incremental improvements. You have to actually invent something new, and then that invention produces all sorts of other effects that you might never have foreseen. The people who invented internal combustion engines presumably never expected airplanes to be possible or whatever. Any sort of technical object that you produce has all kinds of other effects that you can never foresee. As long as it's a real invention in the sense of a creation of a new technical schema. So I think that's the idea here, is that it's as if you're designing a house and you have a certain plan of like, I want to have so many square meters or I want to have so many bedrooms or whatever. And then you find the only way to actually build the house is to make it like twice as big as you actually expected it to be. And so you sort of discover this as you're building it. So I think that's the idea here, is that, to reach a goal, even if you start with a certain goal, to reach that goal, you have to produce something that actually goes beyond the goal that you were trying to reach. Okay, so like I said at the beginning, I need to leave early today, but we can stop here and we'll pick up on, where are we? 175. And we get to talk about Marx a little bit, which is interesting because Simondon doesn't talk about Marx that much. So it's interesting that he mentions dialectics on one page and then he mentions Marx on the next one. So we'll see what exactly he has to say about dialectics in Marx and how it differs from his account of dialectics. and yeah, we'll go from there. Okay, so thanks everyone for coming out. Thanks for your contributions, and I think next week I should be able to do a full session. I don't think I've. Oh, what am I? Yeah, I don't think I have anything else next week. So yeah, let's. Yeah, I'll see you next week. Hopefully, we'll get a full 2 hours in.
That sounds good. Thanks, Nan. Thanks, everyone. Talk to you all next week.